I've seen Bodies, Buddies, Buddies twice now, and I think it's safe to say that the standout is Rachel Sennett's Alice. Why? Well, in a movie about Gen Z, and coming from someone who's Gen Z, I think she's the most authentic character in this movie. Why? Well, it's her main character complex in a movie where she's not the main character. The most noticeable and obvious thing about Alice is the glow sticks she wears. When they're playing Bodies, 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 a game where you're trying not to get caught in the dark, you might be wondering, why is she wearing something that makes her stand out so much? And that's the thing. She wears these glow sticks for attention that gives her attention. Alice knows she's not the most popular person in this friend group. She knows that everyone else is kind of closer to each other than her, so she wears these glow sticks as sort of a metaphor for trying to be like, hey, I'm here, notice me, guys, like, it's me, Alice, like, it's like, I'm different. And that's, I think, something that many Gen Z people are struggling with, is trying to find their voice, trying to find this attention and validation that social media has taught us that we need. And Alice is a victim of this. Another thing I noticed about Alice on a rewatch is basically she just repeats anything that anyone else says, and she very rarely has any original thoughts of her own. While playing Bodies, 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 and everyone's accusing David or mad at David for whatever reason, Alice just keeps saying, David, over and over again. After everyone else has already said David and is mad at David, is when Alice finally decides, oh, all my friends are mad at David, I'm gonna be mad at David too. And that brings me to what I think is the most interesting part about Alice, is that how her allegiances can flip depending on whatever person she's with thinks. This starts when everyone is accusing her boyfriend, Greg, of being the murderer. Like in real life, once someone actually dies, they think Greg did it. And Alice says, no, Greg would never do that. But by the time they get to Greg's bedroom, Alice flips and suddenly does not feel safe going into that bedroom. This is showing her flipping sides and basically going along with what the rest of the group thinks. This just goes to show her natural state is a follower. She's not a leader. This culminates to what I think is the most tense scene in the entire movie, to where Alice, Bea, Jordan, and Sophie are all arguing. Jordan has a gun at this point, and basically Alice is flipping between whatever argument is being made, and finally Sophie accuses her of being racist, and then she has no words left to say and automatically kind of goes back to Sophie's side because she doesn't want to be perceived as racist. This is also the scene where the funniest joke that got the biggest laugh of the theater was, and basically it is where Bea is opening up about her trauma around her mother and her living situation, and then Alice takes this time to make the moment about herself and also shares with the group that she has body dysmorphia. And of course, body dysmorphia is a very serious thing that should be treated seriously, but what makes this situation funny is because it is Bea's time in the spotlight, she's being vulnerable, opening up, and then Alice takes that as an excuse to insert herself into the situation and make it about her, which is something I think we've all noticed in Gen Z online spaces, as that usually when someone's kind of opening up, talking about themselves, so many other people feel the need to insert themselves to be like, hey, like, I'm suffering from this thing too, I'm a victim too, I'm something else. In reality, when that's not appropriate, when someone is opening up to you about their struggles, you should be receptive in helping to them, and in another time you can open up and share to them about what you're going through. It's not that what you're going through doesn't matter, it's that there's a time and place for everything, and stealing the spotlight from someone who's being vulnerable is not the right time. Finally, the thing that sends Alice off the rails is when Sophie reveals that Jordan hate listens to her podcast and makes fun of it. And this is where Alice loses it. Now, of course, say what you want about people who have podcasts nowadays, but with anything, if you're putting any form of media out onto the internet, and yes, I'm too speaking about myself, you have to be at least some form of, self-obsessed, absorbed in a way. If you're putting things out into the internet, you're assuming that people want to hear what you'll say, or people will like what you say. That's literally what I'm doing right now. I'm guilty of it too. So I'm not trying to make fun of anyone with podcasts, but you kind of have to be that person to make a podcast. But really what sends it over the edge is that Alice describes her podcast as hanging out with your smartest and funniest friend, aka herself.
What is your podcast about? Hanging out with your smartest and funniest friend. Did you just groan?
She literally describes herself as the smartest and funniest friend a person could have, when this entire movie beforehand has shown that is literally not the case. She basically just repeats what everyone else is already saying and is willing to follow whatever is appropriate at the time during an argument. An interesting detail that I noticed is the specific wording that Alice uses when she's talking about how hard it is to run her podcast, about having to invite guests and work out a schedule. Basically, a few minutes beforehand, Sophie calls Jordan a human Google Calendar, which is very specific. Like, why can't you just call her a calendar? But saying Google Calendar is specific and makes the dialogue more funny, and it's a funny joke. Then later on, when Alice is ranting about her podcast, she also uses the specific Google Calendar. She's like, it's so hard to set up guests, you have to set up a Google Calendar. I'm like, that's weird. They literally mentioned Google Calendars twice in the span of like 3 minutes. And that goes to show is that I think that Alice was watching and listening, and she thinks that Sophie is a funny person. And so she steals Sophie's sort of joke in a way of the specificity of Google Calendars, and then uses that in her own rant and sort of way of talking. She literally, word for word, emulates the way of talking that Sophie does, which just goes to show again that she's a follower. She doesn't have much original thoughts of her own, which leads me to her demise. What ends up killing her is her first original thought. Basically, the first original thought we really hear Alice say in the entire movie is that she comes up with the theory that whoever was the murderer in the game Bodies, is the murderer in real life. No one else agrees with this, and literally the idea gets shut down in seconds because it doesn't make any sense, because she thinks they're being in the order that they're murdered in the game, even though literally the first murder was not in the right spot in the game. So it's automatically wrong. Her theory is wrong, but she still goes along with it. By the time when Jordan empties her pockets and Alice sees the little slip with the X on it, she thinks that Jordan is the murderer because she's the murderer in the game. And then, of course, this creates the whole big argument. Jordan has a gun. She reveals the thing about her podcast, and it gets crazy, and it ultimately ends in Jordan getting so mad that she shoots Sophie in the leg. They fight over the gun, and then Jordan ends up shooting Sophie. She got killed because she thought she was the main character, that she was the person that figured out all the puzzle pieces. She's the hero that saved everyone else because she figured out who the murderer was. But in reality, she's just a person who repeats what other people say and is willing to go along with whatever idea is most popular at the time. And she just wants the attention on herself even when it's not appropriate. And I think this is realistic because social media and the internet have really romanticized the way that young people should be living their lives in a very unrealistic way, that you have to go on these crazy adventures and be the main character of your own story every single day of your life, and everything has to be about you, and you deserve all these crazy things. But if you're only doing this for the acceptance of others, then that's not really being a main character now, is it? There are gonna be some days, like a wedding. If you go to a wedding, no, you are not the main character. The main people that should have the attention on them are the bride and the groom. They're the people getting married. You sit down, you watch them get married. Not every day of your life is going to be specifically about you, and not everything is going to revolve around you. And yes, I sound like a boomer right now, but I think you are going to be the most happiest when you accept this fact, is that sometimes, even when just your friend is in need of emotional support, that's not about you. That's you helping them get through it. I do think Alice would have benefited from not being a part of this pretty toxic friend group, taking some time to herself, maybe go to therapy, continue that podcast, because I would love to listen to it. I want it to be real so bad. And if she just worked on herself and is happy being who she is without needing the validation from others, then she'd be happy.
I look like I fuck. And that's the vibe I like to put out there.